Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning into our Zoom and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. My name is Gabriela Kaluga Kisuga and I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I'm joined tonight by Nick Seabrook.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Seabrook. I'm the editor here at rabble.ca, and I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Mohawks of Akwesasne.
Also with us tonight are our panelists, which include political scientist and public opinion survey researcher Gabriel DeRush, Madeline Drohan, a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Policy at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Thomas Penaya, co-editor of the book Another World is Possible, and Rabble's own parliamentary reporter Carl Nierenberg. I want to welcome also you guys, our audience, for joining us on Zoom tonight. We hope you participate in the chat and ask any questions to our panelists through our Q&A function. As always, we'll do our best to address your questions. When we last came together for Off the Hill in January, we discussed the NDP's leadership race, which has now culminated in Avi Lewis's victory. Today, our focus is less on domestic politics. The theme for tonight's panel is American Imperialism in 2026, which we appreciate is a moving target. This year began with America's kidnapping of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. Since then, US and Israel have started a conflict with Iran that has global implications. For these reasons, we thought it was high time to discuss how American imperialism is shaping and reshaping the world in 2026, from Tehran to Toronto. While America is aggressively flexing its military muscle, its reputation on the world stage is also suffering. Mark Carney's Davos speech went viral for critiquing America's treatment of the rest of the world, and China appears to be vying to replace the US as the world's most influential nation. So we will dig into all of this tonight.
And to start, I have a question for everyone. It's hard to know the goal or motivations for American foreign policy under Donald Trump, but what forces do you believe sparked this new wave of foreign intervention? Thomas, let's start with you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. Of course, there are numerous specific motivations for why they've been engaging in these foreign interventions, but there are at least three broad motivations. First, every new American administration comes in with the goal of wanting to preserve American hegemony. That is always the first goal. Second, part of the way of doing that is by making sure number two is kept on a leash. Of course, China doesn't want to be on a leash. So how do you deal with that? Well, Iran supplies 12% of China's oil. Venezuela supplies 5% of China's oil. If you control Iran and Venezuela, you have some leverage when you negotiate with China. And the US and China, of course, have a number of meetings scheduled, along with the recent one. The third reason, of course, the obvious reason in a sense, is part of the reason the US is the dominant power is that it preserves the interests of the capitalist system and the capitalist elite. So every intervention has some relationship back to that. It's normal that we focus on the state. Of course, the MAGA conservatives focus on the deep state, but we should never forget that which is deeper than the state. And that's, of course, the capitalist empire, the biggest empire of all. So I'll leave it at those three.
Thank you, Thomas. Madeline, what are your thoughts about this new wave of foreign intervention by the US and what's driving it?
Well, I think the U.S. has had a motivation from the very start about preserving its security. And that underlies a lot of its actions that, in fact, it sort of explains a lot of its actions. But it has been worried about its security from its very creation. Now, I know Trump overuses national security. Everything for him becomes a question of national security. But in some cases, security is the underlying factor for him. And I think what we're seeing is that the US is changing its definition of what makes it feel secure. It used to be this global system that it had helped set up and led, and because it was leading it and everybody was doing basically what it wanted, it felt secure. But you've got a group in there now that doesn't believe in global institutions and are withdrawing back into the US. And so we're seeing different actions, but I think we have to look at them in the frame, in the lens of, is the US doing it to make itself feel more secure? And I think that explains a lot of what it's doing.
Thank you very much, Madeline. And Gabe, what's your perspective on this question?
Well, in so many ways, this is a really fascinating time to think about American imperialism, because on the one hand, of course, when you set up the discussion, you pointed to some actions, some interventions that look very imperialist. On the other hand, the Republican base and the people who are, a lot of Trump's, frankly, is his sort of pitch on foreign policy to the American people was very anti-interventionist, right? It was very much about kind of withdrawing from its role in the world, because they're viewing this as the other countries taking advantage of the United States. For us in Canada, we would sort of laugh at that kind of characterization, but that certainly is a sincerely held belief of many of these people, and I think you kind of see a lot of tension around these interventionist actions that they're taking. You kind of have the sort of Marco Rubio kind of coded side of the Republican base that are maybe a little more in favor of an interventionist foreign policy, and then you have kind of the J.D. Vance side of things, which is very much an isolationist view of America's role in the world. And so, yeah, it's a very fascinating time to be talking about American imperialism, and also a fascinating time to look at the base of the Republicans, of the party in power, and the tension that is going to only get more strained over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Gabe. And Carl, this is a subject you've written about for Rabble since Trump returned to the presidency. What are your views on the change in U.S. foreign policy and the obvious overt belligerence of the Trump administration?
So, the United States has been really from the beginning an imperialist entity, although it claimed it did so under the guise of anti-imperialism, oddly. So, the United States originally was settled by settler colonialists from Europe, who cloaked their mission in a kind of mixture of commerce and kind of a Christian pilgrimism. Even the use of the term pilgrims for the original settlers of the United States gave their mission some kind of holy character, some kind of greater mission, some kind of mission dictated by God, and not merely by the necessity to find a safe haven. We turned it upside down now when we talk about these pilgrims originally settled in the United States as being victims of religious persecution who are seeking a safe place. But really, at the time, they were more seeking to expand the reach of Christian and white civilization. And from the beginning, it was the United States was imperialist or expansionist in that they expanded from the original territory. The original was relatively small territory on the East Coast through the entire 48 states and Alaska. And we know the story of the removals of vast numbers of indigenous people. They took huge whole groups of people whose homes were in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Florida, and they shipped them thousands of miles away into Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, places like that. And just the other day on the radio, there was somebody doing a bit of a report saying he was going to go back with his grandmother to the original tribal home of his people from Oklahoma to Mississippi. But the Americans, without going on and on to the history, the United States has been an expansionist, an imperialist power from the outset of, but again, it's odd. It's always phrased it just as Trump always portrays himself as the victim being unfairly treated, just as he's bullying everybody else. So they came up with the Monroe Doctrine, which is framed as protecting the integrity of the Western Hemisphere and of the nations in the Western Hemisphere, all of Latin America and the United States, against the predatory European imperialism, which, of course, in the 18th century was still a major and viable force. But the Monroe Doctrine then became the basis for continued ongoing American intervention in its own backyard. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, who was the great, later skipped to the post-World War I era, who was the great liberator and the great inventor of the term self-determination, while he was engineering self-determination for the white and Christian former elements of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and some of the Turkish Empire, he was occupying Nicaragua and Haiti and Honduras and then the Philippines. So, I mean, the Americans frame their imperialist goal as being Christianizing, making the world safe for democracy, and preventing other empires from interfering in their sphere of influence. And of course, it switched at some point. It switched from being the empires of the old empires of Europe to being the threat, an imperialism that was framed as the communist threat at one time. And in a way, what's different now, and I'll end it there, is that Trump has, for the longest time, whoever was in charge of America wanted to give it some nobility to the American mission, that we never were saying we are building an American empire, or at least for the entire 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. You have to go back to the end of the 19th century to William McKinley to be who was the last president who was proudly an imperialist and who used the term consciously, self-consciously, and openly, and said, we are building an American empire. And when he was greeted, there is a famous story of him being greeted in Buffalo by supporters shortly before he was assassinated. Welcome to our president and leader of our empire, William McKinley. No other president has used that rhetoric to describe himself since, until Trump. Trump, interestingly enough, Trump's two favorite presidents, his predecessors, whom he admires the most, are not Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin Roosevelt, Eisenhower, not even Reagan. His two role models are both significant imperialist figures of their era, Andrew Jackson of the Indian Wars, so-called, and William McKinley. And he is deliberately now, he wants to, in the style of McKinley, expand the territory of the United States. So it's for Canadians, it's a scary kind of imperialism, because Trump is open about that, and Trump has an ambition to see one country that includes not just the current lower 48 and Alaska, but also all of Canada and Greenland. He wants, because he wants that, then the United States will be territorially the largest country in the world. It won't be in population, it won't, but its population will increase by a relatively marginal amount. But that is Trump's ambition. It's very different from a president, even Lyndon Johnson or Eisenhower, who said we're defending ourselves against the intrusion of communists, and we are defending ourselves against other empires and other powers, and we're protecting our security. So I think there's a qualitative difference now. We're headed towards a very old-fashioned concept of empire that goes back to the Romans and Napoleon and to William McKinley.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. Gabby, I think you had the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carl. You've put this moment into some really interesting perspective. And so the next question, I'm going to hand it over to Thomas now. How are the imperialist actions like the military intervention, America's military intervention in Iran, reshaping global perceptions of the country? How is this affecting the American empire now?
Well, okay, let me just add a few points in terms of what Carl said, because I thought I agree completely with Carl's point here. What's interesting about the US is that it sees itself as having broken from the British Empire, as having helped dismantle the British Empire after World War II, as having defeated the Nazi Empire, and as having caused the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So this is part of its kind of anti-imperial self-conception. At the same time, it has a network of 750 military bases around the world. Its military spending is greater than the next 9 spenders combined. You add up China, Russia, India, South Korea, Japan, England, Germany, France. It is still less than what the US is spending. The US is always ready for intervention. So this is the weird contradiction you get in the US. On one hand, anti-imperial, on the other hand, always ready for intervention. In terms of, I think one thing also to point out is you'll note that for the last 75 years, people are always going on about the US being in decline. Whenever there's an economic crisis, like the 1973 OPEC oil crisis or the 2008 financial crisis, or whenever there's a military crisis, 1951 Korea, 1974 Vietnam, 2003 Iraq, 2021 Afghanistan, and of course now 2026 Iran, you start getting the declinist narrative. It just keeps coming back. The problem is, for the last 50 years, the US consistently produces 20 to 25% of global GDP. One country out of 200 countries has an incredible amount of economic productivity. It would be like, for anyone who's following the Montreal Canadiens, if Cole Caulfield scored 20% of the Canadiens' goals for the next 50 years, he would be a hockey god. This is the US position over the last 50 years. And so you can never underestimate the US's ability to reinvent itself and reemerge from a crisis stronger than ever.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And for those of you in the chat, I believe we dropped in a link to a recent episode of Rabble Radio that we did with Thomas, where he goes even more into depth on this issue. Gabe, my next question is to you, and it's about middle powers like Canada. We heard in Davos, Mark Carney lay out what he said was a vision for middle powers. He's been criticized for maybe not quite sticking to that vision. But what are your thoughts? How can middle powers like Canada exist in a world of this new US imperialism?
Well, you brought up Davos, so maybe I can quote a line from Prime Minister Carney's Davos speech. He said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that, I think, is one sort of prescription. And a big piece of that is the concept of coalitions, being at the table and building your own coalition. So I'm a public opinion researcher, and some numbers that have stuck out to me over the past few months are some numbers around Canadians' appetite to get more involved with the European Union. Right, 75% of Canadians are interested in closer cooperation with the EU. Nearly half, 48%, actually support Canada joining the EU as a member state. So that idea of being at the table has, in a very formal way, as part of a coalition that is not as U.S. Dependent, is popular in Canada. So on the one hand, Canadians are interested in following Prime Minister Carney's path of new coalitions, and the second half of that is how middle powers can adapt to the new sort of chaotic order is developing our own sovereign capacity, right? So particularly in defense, in energy, so much of the discussion about our kind of sovereign capacity in energy is focused on pipelines and fossil fuels, but the world is moving toward a clean energy transition, and Canada happens to be resource rich in a lot of components that are very, very important to the clean energy transition. So I'd like to see a bit more of a focus there from this government. But on things like food and tech, I mean, one of my current obsessions is like the American dominance in AI, second only to China. So there's a need. Or, sorry, not second only. China is in a quite distant second from the US's position of dominance. So there is a need for middle powers like Canada to develop some sovereign capacity. We are probably hopeless in competing with the United States on things like kind of compute power that you need for real sovereign AI capacity, but certainly on defense, on energy, especially clean energy, and technology investments in that sovereign capacity are essential, and there is public support for that. So yeah, coalitions, investments in sovereign capacity, those I think would be the two key ways that Canadians themselves see the country setting up a bulwark.
Thank you so much, Gabe. I think that sets out an interesting perspective for us here in Canada. I wanted to pass the next question on to Madeline. We know there are many progressives, including Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who oppose America's new military imperialism in America. So how can America's progressives strategically turn the tide against things like the Monroe Doctrine and America's new military aggression? And I guess additionally, how can us in Canada, people like us in Canada, support those efforts?
Those are big questions. I think in Canada, we are uniquely unprepared, or have been uniquely unprepared for this latest turn in American foreign policy, because we were lulled into complacency, I think, through this post-Second World War era of friendly relations. And I don't know how many people you hear quote all the time, the John Kennedy quote about history made us neighbors, or geography. I can't remember the exact quote, but the idea is that we're supposedly friends. And I think a lot of Canadians sort of swallowed that idea that we were friends with the Americans, when we might be friends on an individual level, but countries don't have friends, they have interests. But all of which is to say, when American imperialism reemerged, because it wasn't just created with Trump, he's just picking up on something that's been below the surface, we weren't ready to respond either on a personal level or on a national level as well. We've been scrambling ever since. So that's just to talk about Canadians. How could they help progressives in the US? I'm not sure, because my experience and everything I've read about American politics is they're very insular, in that the voices from inside are quite loud. They don't really hear the voices from outside. And I would say that's doubly so for Canada, because Canada is an afterthought for most Americans. So to have voices coming from Canada on either faction probably wouldn't make much of an impact. And I think one way we can make an impact and support progressives in the States is by our actions. The boycotts of travel and American goods, and that they do seem to have attracted notice. I don't know that they've made a huge impact, but they show that, not everyone is happy with the policies there. But generally speaking, I think it's going to be Americans and American politicians that are going to sort out who comes out on top on this. And we don't really have a lot of say in that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Madeline. And before we go to our audience questions, First, we're going to have another question where we go around the horn and get everyone's perspective. And the question that we're going to be pitching to everybody will be, what are the long-term consequences of Donald Trump's foreign policy, particularly as it relates to Canada's relationship to the United States? And Carl, I'll start with you.
Well, it's quite disastrous for Canada, but to back up a bit, I mean, we made it. It wasn't just that we were, as Madeline said quite correctly, that we were unprepared for an aggressive, assertive, and hostile United States, that we thought they'd always play nice, and it's kind of been a cold shower that they don't always play nice. And the fact is, they haven't always played nice. If you could bring Laurier back to life and talk to them about the negotiations for the Alaska boundary, at the time the negotiators they were actually British negotiators at the time, said, "Oh my God, these Americans, you can't talk to them." I mean, they don't, their concept of compromise is what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. So it's ever been thus. But the point is that we made choices 70 or more years ago to pursue a completely continentalist, North American continentalist policy rather than some other kind of more multilateral policy, and also to pursue an entirely corporate and private enterprise, essentially private enterprise basis for economic development when we had other options. I mean, people like Linda McQuaig, who've written about this, talk about how during World War II, C.D. Howe created all these crown corporations, most of which they got rid of after World War II. We did keep some, and we had some. At one point, we had a crown corporation that produced vaccines. We had a crown corporation that produced airplanes. Air Canada was a crown corporation. The CN was a crown corporation. CBC still is for the time being. But Lester Pearson, his finance minister, Walter Gordon, asked a young chap named Mel Watkins, who some old people like me will remember as a significant political economist and political activist in Canadian history, to do a report on foreign investment and foreign control of our economy, the Watkins Report. And he proposed, one of the institutions he proposed is the Foreign Investment Review Agency, which existed for many years, which was created by the either Pearson or Trudeau government. He also suggested an investment agency. He suggested a total coherent strategy for weaning ourselves away from the United States, with which we were much less linked way back in the 1960s than we are now, and for using the power of public ownership and the state to create a much more self-sufficient Canadian economy and developing multilateral trade relations. He wasn't the one who emphasized the trade relations, but others who were experts on trade. There was a man named Mel Clark, who was a trade negotiator and an expert on trade, who was a big critic of Brian Mulrooney's craven negotiation with Ronald Reagan at the time in the 1980s, when we signed the original free trade agreement with the Americans, saying, no, we should not be in a bilateral arrangement that's very unbalanced. We're this country at the time, maybe 25 million, and they're that country, 240 or 250 million. It's ridiculous. You can't have two partners, one of whom is 10 times the size of the other. We've got to be branching out and creating multilateral relationships. My question is whether that train has already left, whether it's almost too late. I mean, I'm wondering how we can rebuild. I don't see Mr. Carney doing it, because Mr. Carney's strategy essentially is to bribe the business community to invest in Canada. But the business community owes loyalty to nothing but its bottom line. I mean, just as they were going about in this great effort of kowtowing to the business community and cutting a small increase in capital gains tax, for instance, and doing our best to throw money at the business community so they'll invest in Canada, the Bank of Montreal sold a big subsidiary that it had to dealing with transport and other issues to an American company.
Right.
There's nothing, money will go. People who are only in the business of making money will make money however they can. They could care less about the Canadian flag or about maple syrup. So I think we need an entirely different strategy. I think Mr. Lewis at the NDP has the glimmerings of the instinct of how we might be able to do it, but he has not worked it out in any kind of detailed or programmatic way. But we're not seeing any kind of serious effort to create a sovereign country, even if it is still possible when you consider that 7 out of every $10 of our exports are to the United States. How do you move that ship around? How do you change that?
Right. Thank you very much for your perspective and your answer on this question, Carl. Thomas, I'm going to go to you and ask you for your perspective on the long-term consequences of Donald Trump's foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'll build on what Madeline and Carl have said, and Gabe, maybe just to give some background context. One thing that's interesting about, Trump economically, in terms of economic policy, internally and externally, is very consistent with Reagan. This is just following on the Reagan neoliberal revolution. What has that produced? Well, here's what's interesting. German and Japanese automakers outsource work to American workers. Now think about that. They outsource to American workers because they can pay the American worker less, give the American worker less benefits than the German or Japanese worker, meaning the average German or Japanese worker has a higher quality of life than the average American worker. Now, and of course, the stats bear that out: life expectancy, education levels, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting about this must be the first empire in world history where the citizens of the empire live a lower quality of life than the countries they conquered. Germany and Japan were conquered in World War II by the Americans, but they live a higher quality of life. That's a recipe for a massive social transformation. And this is the reason right now we've seen this increase not only in the far right, but in the far left. Sanders, AOC, Zoran Mamdani have become more prominent over the last few years. And it's the outcome of this kind of these neoliberal policies. So I think that, we should follow the lead of those three, actually. Build democratic socialism in our cities or even in our province. Push for that as the alternative. Trump's policies, building on Reagan, have undermined the public's faith in an unregulated, dysregulated capitalist system. The public wants regulation. This is the moment for democratic socialism. Of course, I would go further. I would say a spiritual democratic socialism, but at least democratic socialism. I think this is a great moment for us to build that, not only in Canada, but in countries all around the world.
A hopeful way to end that answer. Thank you, Thomas. And Gabe, for you, let's go to you. What are your thoughts on the long-term consequences of this moment in history?
Well, a short-term consequence, of course, will have long-term implications. Is that the Trumpian posture resulted in the re-election of a liberal government, which was not otherwise going to happen, right? So the sort of short-run domestic political consequences for Canada were kind of on day one, or let's say a few months in, were fairly dramatic. But overall, so full disclosure, I'm sitting in the United States. I'm a Canadian. I'm from Toronto, but I have a job at the University of California. So I'm down here, and it is hard not to, I think, notice that for all of the Trumpian coalitions complaining about a decline in American decline, which Thomas sort of gave us some good historical context on that. The Trumpian foreign policy has arguably pushed countries like Canada even further further away, and weakened the United States in globally, and that seems to that's one of the contradictions in this sort of discussion of imperialism, and you see it in Canada. More Canadians are much more open to certainly trade alliances with China, possibly even deeper than that. And so, the Trumpian posture has essentially strengthened America's historical enemies, let's say, and pushed countries like Canada away. If it pushes Canada toward the European Union, I mean, that's a different outcome than pushing Canada towards China. But this a necessity that Canadians feel to put our eggs in other baskets is a direct result of the Trumpian posture.
All right, Gabe, thank you very much. Madeline, I'd like to finish us up on this question of the long-term consequences of Trump's foreign policy.
Yeah, well, this is picking up directly from Gabe, actually, because Trump's foreign policy has managed, I'm going to look at it in the Canadian context, has pushed Canada away, has forced Canadians to start thinking, at least, about making some tough decisions about how they should operate in future vis-a-vis the US. And I know this sounds a bit strange, but I worry that that it will end too soon. That under this pressure, it is pushing Canada to look at other markets, look at the EU, like Gabe was saying, and try to sort of, make up for all those lost years that Carl was talking about. But I suspect that if Trump was all of a sudden replaced or whatever, and there was a more accommodating foreign policy put in place, then everyone would say, oh, great, let's just go back to the way things were before. And the way things were before weren't really great for Canada. And so, as painful as this shock is, and it's pretty painful for a lot of people, I think it's necessary and might have to be prolonged to produce the better consequences for Canada. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I think that was a really good question or answer. And as we move on, kind of on the same topic of consequences, we'll move to our audience questions now. And the first question I wanted to pose to everyone is from Robin Brown. The question is, what are things that Trump has done that would take the longest for a democratic government to fix? And are there things that can't be repaired? I think to start us off, I'll hand it over to Thomas.
I'm not sure how to answer this in a kind of simple way. I don't think there's anything that Trump has done that I can like or appreciate. The only good thing is, of course, as others have pointed out, it's mobilized a huge opposition to him. I don't think anything is unsalvageable, because we see one thing with the US, we see the way they go back and forth. They have a tendency to, we had similar discussions during the George W. Bush presidency. There was this feeling that Bush has been horrible. He's done all these horrible things. And of course, the US then pivoted and elected Barack Obama, which on one hand was an improvement, but then kind of covered the deeper problem, which is getting at this issue of the dominance of neoliberal globalization, the dominance of these economic policies, which maintain the US empire, but hollow out the US internally. So I think that's, again, the lesson for me is you've got to confront the problem. It's not simply at the level of the state. It's not simply at the level of electing better people. You've got to actually come up with viable institutional models as alternatives. Right. So this is where, we're lucky. The Scandinavians have lots of productive models that have worked. We can learn from that. There are all kinds of interesting models all over the world in terms of participatory budgets, decentralized economic decision making, and so on around the world. So I would look to alternatives from around the world and begin to build something new but build on the kind of grave of neoliberalism. It's done. We don't need to continue that project. I mean, that's been the biggest disappointment around Carney. He just continues on that without solving that deeper problem. So I think that's where I would begin.
Yeah, thank you so much for starting us off, Thomas. Madeline, what's your take on this?
Well, one of the things that Trump has done is eroded the public's faith in just about everything, in institutions, the good ones and the bad ones, but in the media. He's totally eroded anybody's trust in the media. He's eroded people's belief that there's actually truth, that there are facts. He's managed to persuade a lot of people about what did Kellyanne Conway call them, alternate facts or alternate reality. And I think when the people, and this has spread beyond the US, well beyond the US, because, other leaders have picked up on it as well, other parties and that. And I think something like that, when trust and faith in principles is gone, that's not an overnight project to bring it back.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you now, Carl. What's your take on this?
You're muted.
Sorry, Carl.
I thought it was much improved if you couldn't hear me. If it was going to be a silent movie here, we're going to do the Buster Keaton version of my answer. But to look at intangible ways, what parts of the toothpaste you can't put back in the tube. I mean, Trump, U.S. foreign aid wasn't necessarily the most benevolent. I mean, and a great many people who were involved in USAID were working for the CIA or no, and we're working on other projects than helping the developing world. But on the other hand, they were investing a lot in women's health, in treating contagious and diseases of one kind or the other, such as malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS, and as well in community development and capacity building in developing countries. They're out of that business pretty much completely now. I mean, whether you can build up something not just resembling what used to be, but something new. There's no market for it. I mean, people in general, including in Canada, just see it. They don't understand the benefit of participating in the world economy via sharing our wealth and expertise with other people and helping develop independent and thriving economies in other countries that are poorer than we are. I mean, it's just amazing how people don't get that and don't understand that, and we never can convince them of it. So that's something that is ended. The increase in military spending is already huge, but Trump is insisting on vastly increasing it. At the same time, the depression of the capacity to finance the government through taxes, cutting taxes and increasing spending, but almost entirely military spending. And then, for Americans in general, for the Americans who had some mitigated benefit from Obamacare, that is largely on a downward slide now. Millions of people are losing it. It was never great. It was never Canada's single payer system or France's or Germany's or other countries. They're all different. It was actually a kind of funhouse mirror distorted version of a system that works quite well in small Switzerland, a private insurance-based universal healthcare system, except the Swiss make it work so that everybody's actually covered in Switzerland. Everybody was never properly covered in the United States, but they continue to underfund it and weaken it. First, they got rid of the issue of the so-called mandate, and now they're just cutting the money, and so people will start dying in the United States of treatable diseases because they can't get insurance. So those are some ways in which he's changed the system for good. In ways that aren't going to be very easy to repair. How much environmental damage can you have? How much air pollution can you have that you can then correct later on? I mean, here in Canada, we have a stupid. I'm sorry to say this to my dear friend, liberal friends, and Mr. Carney, but a government that small-mindedly is starting to say that environmental measures and environmental regulation are too costly because we have to deal with the American threat. In the United States, they simply say the environment isn't a real issue. Climate change is a myth. It's a hoax, and they're acting on that belief. And how are you going to possibly reel that in and reinstate that? The planet will pay the price. A warming planet is going to pay the price of these policies. And you know, a friend of mine who was a former EU diplomat for a major EU country said, you know, 16 minutes after Trump became president, it's going to shift the entire world dialogue on politics is going to shift. He's going to create new terms of reference for everybody. And we see it here in Canada. This man we've elected supposedly to resist and fight against Trump is in many silly ways becoming a kind of very mild and polite Canadian version of sort of Trump light. Rather than preach climate change denialism, we simply do nothing about climate change because we say it's too costly. I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you, Carl. Sorry, Gabby. And just before we go on to the next question, Gabe, given your unique perspective as being in the U.S., just want to get your thoughts on the damage Trump's done. What would take the longest to fix in terms of the impact that Donald Trump has had?
Well, on U.S. foreign policy and its relationship with potential allies, I think it's a permanent disruption to the kind of calculation that anyone is going to make in wanting to cooperate with the United States. So we're talking about U.S. imperialism and, you know, the other countries' participation in American foreign policy. There's now just huge downside risk to cooperation, and I think that is a permanent change. It's totally undermined, you know, other countries' faith that the U.S. will abide by things like treaties and, you know, trade agreements, these kinds of things that are just another country has no alternative other than to hedge against American policy change. Let's call it that. That's a sort of euphemistic way of talking about Trumpism, but yeah, and I think that's a permanent change.
All right, interesting perspective, Gabe. Thank you very much. And on to our next audience question. I'm going to mix two together here because they're about a very similar topic related to tonight's issue. One's from Robin Brown, one's from Penny Clipperton. Does the United Nations have any role to play in reining in American imperialism? Penny Clipperton says that Dr. John Gardner has predicted that Donald Trump is likely to use a nuclear weapon against Iran or some other country. So is there not a global responsibility for the UN to try and do what it can to weigh in here? So I'll open this up to the floor. Who'd like to weigh in on this issue of the UN? You muted again, Carl.
Well, you see, I was asked to do this, so I'm so stupid. I don't understand that it works two ways. Look, the United Nations is a permanently stalemated entity, the Security Council, so it is designed that way. So the United Nations is not going to act against one member of the Security Council. It can't. It has no way of doing it. And if the General Assembly were to vote something, because the General Assembly works on a majority vote, it would be meaningless because you need the Security Council to do anything. And that was a deliberate design in that the United Nations was not supposed to be taking on battles on one side or the other. It was supposed to be a means by which a committee of, you know, a council of elders of the great powers would get together and regulate and deal with the post-World War II world. So I can't see the United Nations taking on any greater role than it does now, but I'm interested in what the other panelists might have to say about that.
Gabe?
Well, I think we should watch for Donald Trump to defund the United Nations. U.S. is a major contributor to the UN, and there's negative appetite for continued funding. I know some are musing about the potentially relocating the United Nations out of New York City. I don't know how realistic these things are, especially with 2 years left in the term. Knowing the UN bureaucracy, it probably takes more time for them to decide what to have for breakfast. But these I don't know about the prediction that Trump's going to use a nuclear weapon, but I think it's more likely that he will defund the United Nations, and the UN should be prepared for that.
Anyone else want to weigh in, or will we roll on? Thomas?
Well, I mean, I think Carl's point is correct, and Gabe's point is correct. The United Nations is kind of a stalemated entity. Its power, though, is symbolic. That the world should have a space where every country can come in, and underrepresented groups can also have some space. For example, people of African descent or indigenous people can have a space where they can talk to the world's nations, and also themselves network amongst themselves and build some sort of coalition. The problem is when the space has been so weakened, it's hard to believe in the space. But the idea of the space, I think, is very important. So is there an alternative way to create that, like some global space where people can come together and speak about what the world actually needs, right? I mean, outside of national state interests, or national elite interests. How can we create that? I think that's the thing that's important. I mean, about 20 years ago, we had the World Social Forum, which was a very interesting model in terms of pulling together activists from around the world and debating and getting us to learn about different countries' issues. It was a great a space for that. And so I think, I guess a kind of interesting one right now is Progressive International, which tries to pull together activists from around the world and have these kinds of dialogues. I think that's still very important. So I wouldn't want to lose the idea of the United Nations. I don't want us to go back to a time of just warring empires. We need to have some sort of belief, I think, that humanity can come together and produce alternatives.
All right. Anyone else want to weigh in on this, or we'll roll right along to our next question, which I think will come from Gabby.
Yeah, sounds good. Sorry for interrupting you a little bit there, Nick. Thank you so much for your answer there, Thomas. We're getting close to our time, but I want to ask one more audience question from Robin Brown, and this one is specifically to you, Madeline. It's calling on the point you made about what is motivating the U.S. is foreign intervention, all of that. You had mentioned security. And Robin asks, are the U.S.'s actions making it more secure? Specifically keeping in mind what's been happening this year with Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran.
Well, I think there's two ways of answering that question, because does the Trump administration think that they're making them more secure? And then actually, are they really in actual fact? And I would say no, in actual fact, but I could see in some weird sort of version of security in the Trump administration's mind that they think things like, for example, saying they want to make Canada and Greenland and Venezuela all the 51st, 52nd, and 53rd states. You could see that as gaining buffers around the US. It's not that they really want any of those countries necessarily for their intrinsic worth, even although people talk about critical minerals and that, but just to sort of pad out the US to sort of give it more insulation against world threats. So I could see that fitting in with the security, but I would have to agree. I think this is what the questioner is implying, that in actual fact, the fallout from all of these, the sort of severed relationships, the hurt feelings, the amounting distrust of the US is all making it less secure than it was before. So it's not accomplishing what should be the prime underlying factor of the foreign policy was protecting the citizens of the United States. Can
And
I just add one thing to that? Sorry. Because I think we're coming to a very dangerous period in the United States with foreign policy and specifically Trump. And that's these midterm elections that are coming up. Because if the Republicans are humiliated, which some of the polls show that they will be, I think at that point, Trump and his administration, it'll be sort of no holds barred. They'll be trying all sorts of different things. And I think we have to worry about that as Canada and the rest of the world as well.
All right, very good points, Madeline. And is there anyone else who wants to weigh in on this question of, is the US more secure with the actions that it's been taking? Carl, I see you unmuted.
No, no, they're definitely not. They're definitely not more secure with the actions they're taking with increasing military spending and nuclear saber rattling and getting together with the most violent and extreme elements in Israeli society to create a completely untenable situation in that region. There's nothing particularly secure about. I don't know if there even domination is the goal, not necessarily security. But when you overreach, with your efforts to dominate, you undermine your security.
Very good points, Carl. Anyone else who would like to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just say that on the Iran issue, and by the way, Gabby, I realized that you had asked me about this and I didn't really fully get to an answer. Part of the problem is because I have a 5-year-old, I haven't slept in 5 years. So I have a bit of like dadnesia. So, but the Iran thing is interesting because a lot of people kind of focus on Netanyahu as the main instigator of that attack, but the Gulf states also wanted that attack. And of course, the Christian Zionists that surround Trump, his top advisors, I think them especially wanted that attack because they think, of course, that the Messiah will eventually reemerge from Israel. So they want Israel to be the most powerful state. What's interesting is that one has not led to more security, right? The Iranians went right after the global economy in response. So that has not led to more security. I think what the next step the US will do is try to create a grand compact with China. And that will make things secure for US investment. I think that's the goal with China. So I think that's going to be the more interesting thing to watch in the future. How Trump will try to get out of this situation is create this kind of unprecedented compact with China.
All right, thank you very much. And just before we go, I was wondering, does anybody have any sort of final thoughts before we wrap up? If not, that's all right. I think we've covered a lot of really fantastic ground tonight. And that is all the time I think we have for audience questions. I want to thank everyone in the audience who came out to join us tonight and everyone who took the time to ask some questions. If you want to support the work we do here at Rabble, please visit rabble.ca/donate. I want to thank all of our panelists. It was a fantastic discussion. We're living in truly, as they often say, unprecedented times. And I think it's important for the progressive left to have these important discussions and debates and to get our thoughts out there as to how to approach the times that we're living in. I'll say to our audience, our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return after our summer break. Once again, thank you for everyone who made this show possible tonight, both on screen and off. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again after the summer. Be well, take care, and read rabble.ca.
Goodbye. Thank you.